Planning and Zoning Commission for the City of Granbury will come to order on 6 p.m. on Monday, September the 9th, 2024, Granbury City Hall, City Council Chambers. The first item on the agenda tonight is public comments on agenda items that are non-public hearing agenda items. Do we have anyone that would like to speak on those items? If not, we'll move into the consent agenda, which is approval of the regular meeting minutes from August the 12th, 2024. Do I have any changes, additions? No? Do I have a motion to approve as presented?
Make a motion to approve as presented.
I have a motion by Mr. Class to approve the minutes as presented. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Second by Mr. Moore. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. It takes us to D1 on our agenda tonight, public hearing for consider recommending approval of the request of Catherine Voss. You want to help me with that one? Espinosa, okay. For a specific use permit to allow animal grooming in a light commercial LC zoning district. The property is addressed as 816 North Houston. Okay.
Good evening, Ms. Chair and Commission. Like stated, this is at 816 North Houston. It is 0.24 acres, and it is a portion of the Barton addition. The purpose for tonight is to renew the SUP that was given an original timeline of 2 years. It is zoned light commercial, and for animal grooming in light commercial, it requires a SUP. Here's the new proposed site plan. And with SUPs, it is consideration for P&Z to see if it generally conforms with the comprehensive plan and the city objectives. So we looked at it, and the use is harmonious and compatible with the surrounding areas or proposed use. It is zoned light commercial, and it's on State Highway 51. It has been a business for 2 years now and is successfully carried on. As we checked with code enforcement, police, there are no violations, no issues, no calls for service, anything like that that would be problematic. And on June 27th, city staff mailed out 14 public notices. The property owners within 200 feet, and actually this is supposed to be August, not June, and it was published in the Hood County News as well. We actually had one letter in favor this morning that we got for the SUP, and staff recommends approval of the SUP. And the voting options for tonight: recommend approval of the SUP as presented, recommend approval of the SUP with additional conditions, or recommend denial of the SUP.
Thank you, Cody. I'll open the public hearing, and it's the applicant here. Would you like to speak?
I can if you need to ask me.
Okay. Commission members, do you have any questions for the applicant? No questions? You're off the hook. Any questions for staff? No? Then I'll close the public hearing and entertain. Oh, I have one question. So before we had a time limit, now we don't, correct?
Right. We're not suggesting any time limit on this one, and it's just from here on out as the business operates.
Okay, great. All right, so I'll close the public hearing and entertain a vote on the SUP request.
Chair, I move to approve as presented.
Have a motion to approve the SUP as presented.
Second.
Have a second by Mr. Hallman. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. All right, next item on the agenda is discussion items, Section E and E1, a monthly plat approval report from the city.
So the first one, we had Wallace Addition. It was a minor plat that had some waivers up to not upgrade Porter Court to urban standards and to not extend sewer or water. Considering there isn't sewer or water in the area, it kind of makes sense, as well as the sidewalks and upgrading Porter Court to urban standards. It's partially a county road right there in front of them, and so it's got bar ditches and small roadways. It was originally zoned, or it is still zoned interim holding, and this plat was created so that they could add an additional barn to the rear of the building with the elderly lady moving here, and they're clearing out their ranch, so they've got some extra storage that's needed for the property. And then second, we've got Saratoga Phases 3 and 4 with the final plat without waivers. Y'all are well aware of where Saratoga is, so I won't go into that fully, but that one was approved, and FIA was approved in August by council. And then we have this, I'm not sure if Kira's back yet. We've got an announcement for Commission's Board and Training Workshop, if y'all are interested. That's going to be in January, I believe 7th, correct? 6th and 7th in January that we would like to get some members going to, and it's in Arlington this year, so it could fill up really quickly with seats being taken by other municipalities in the area. We'd like to get the P&Z to go to that and hear some of the good ideas that they have and new state requirements for public hearings and commissions that we have. So if y'all are interested in that, talk with Rita and let her know, and if you want to pass that on to Kira or myself, we can get that lined out.
I can do that.
Yes, ma'am. And our last item for discussion tonight is going to be the comprehensive plan update and where we're at on this process. We've got Freeze and Nichols here tonight, and Mr. Jones is going to come up and give us a rundown of where we're at and what's going on with it. If you want it, you can.
All right, good evening, members of the Planning and Zoning Commission. Glad to be back in front of you this evening. I'm going to have a fairly lengthy presentation tonight, so I'm going to try to go through it as quickly as possible. You have some handouts in front of you to provide some reference for some of the things that we're going to be talking about tonight. Mainly going to zero in on our draft future land use, the process behind coming up with some of those recommendations, some of the feedback that we heard that ties into those recommendations. With that, we're going to talk about housing and some strategies around dealing with housing topics and some of the feedback that we heard from the community and from P&Z on housing. And then we're going to briefly touch on the preliminary thoroughfare map updates. We're not going to go too much in detail about that. We do have a couple of suggestions as to how we can improve the existing thoroughfare map. Did want to point out that there are discussions that are ongoing with the county, since they're also going through a thoroughfare plan update currently, and we're trying to align those two pieces. So that's still a work in progress, and I'm going to spend most of our time tonight looking at future land use, some new categories that we've been looking at, specifically centered around the lake and downtown, and then some housing strategies and updating that chapter. So just to orient you, we're about halfway through our timeline. This is a 14-month process. We've gone through our project initiation, we've done our background work and our data collection, we've done our community snapshot, we've gotten one round of public input. We're hoping to get a couple more rounds of public input, especially now that we're really getting into the meat and potatoes of the plan with the future land use map, with the thoroughfare plan, and with housing recommendations. We want to go back to the community after we have this discussion with you tonight. We're going to make some tweaks to these plans and then go back to the community hopefully early next month to present some of those concepts and get some really good public feedback as we're drafting the rest of the chapters. We have another workshop that is planned for P&Z in November. At that point, we'll be discussing both the outcomes of these chapters and also some of our other chapters in our current plan, our natural resources chapter, our downtown and historic preservation chapter. We've also got an economic development chapter that we hope to be working with Shay very closely on, the new economic development director. So we'll be bringing back some of those strategies and discussions as well in November, along with annexation, growth management, update to those portions of the code. And lastly, we'll hopefully be coming back to P&Z and council in the early part of next year, late winter, early spring, looking to adopt and finalize the plan so that y'all can begin implementation. So on the timeline that you have on your screen, you'll see that we're, again, about halfway through. We've got some chapters drafted. We're in the process of drafting a few more chapters. So as we're kind of in the heart of that orange area, again, there's the 2 workshops. After tonight, we'll come back to you in November to look at the rest of those chapters. So I'll get into the heart of the presentation tonight, and like I said, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly and then wrap up and hopefully have some discussion and some feedback. As we're going through the presentation, you'll see little prompts on the slides when we've got a handout that gives you more information or a zoomed-in view, since we've got a lot of maps that have small icons or the colors might blur together a little bit on the screen. You've got the handouts to refer to. So the 2 packets are the presentation itself, and then the larger handouts has some more detailed information and has those maps. So just to give a brief overview, this is very brief, because we feel that y'all have a lot of experience in this realm, so we don't want to go too in-depth into this, but our enabling legislation that we're referring back to and creating the future land use plan is Chapter 213 of the Texas Local Government Code that states that zoning decisions, you just looked at an SUP tonight, zoning changes must tie back to a city's adopted plan. So this is obviously a key component of that future land use plan, is the map that dictates or provides policy as to how development will occur. Since Granbury is about 50% built out, that means that 50% of the land will have, we know, some future use as you begin developing. But even that 50% that's already developed will undergo redevelopment, and uses will change over time. So this is a policy guide to show how the change should take place, what the values of Granbury are, and how those are applied on the ground at a geographic scale. So each city is given the leeway to decide what's included in the plan. Texas law has a lot of very specific regulations. The state legislature likes to tell cities what to do. More and more so, they like to tell cities what to do, how to do it. But one realm in which the city has a lot of discretion is how it does its comprehensive plan, how it does its map, and how it relates that to things like the zoning ordinance and the subdivision ordinance. So again, this policy as part of the plan is just that. It's a policy. It's not law in and of itself. It's not set in stone, but it does provide a basis for discussion, should provide a basis for decision making when it comes to land use decisions. Should be based on guiding principles. And these guiding principles, again, should relate back to the city's values. We looked at this last time in our last workshop with 6 guiding principles that relate back to what we heard from our public input period. And each of the recommendations and the strategies that we'll present as this process goes along, starting tonight with some of our housing strategies, but also working its way into the other chapters, particularly implementation, particularly the way that the plan goes into action, will tie back to each of these guiding principles. So as we go through our presentation tonight, a couple of questions to keep in mind. What are the appropriate land uses for undeveloped areas? Like we just mentioned, 50% of the city is undeveloped. What should those land uses be? Should any areas kind of be looked at differently over time compared to what they are now, whether they're undeveloped or we might consider them underdeveloped, that they developed back in a time when economic circumstances were a little bit different, land values were a little bit different, the city's priorities were different. Should those start to change over time in certain areas, and which areas are those, and what should those changes be? What are some special areas? Obviously, a couple that come to mind are downtown, the lakefront, our 377 corridor, our loop corridor. Those are the pretty easy ones to pick out, and we're going to highlight most of those tonight as either falling under overlays or falling into special classifications. But are there any special areas that we miss? Are the boundaries, do they need to change? Do they need to get larger? Do they need to get smaller? That's the type of feedback and things that we want to discuss tonight. Don't need to spend too much time on this. I mean, the future land use categories, as you'll see with the map and the categories, they're for the most part very conventional. If you spent time on P&Z, you've probably spent time looking at the current future land use map, looking at your current categories, and the continuum of most intense uses on the industrial side to least intense uses on the single-family residential side, and everything in between in terms of your higher density housing and your commercial and retail. Things will look very similar to that as we go through the presentation tonight. So bring you back to the June P&Z workshop. We had what I hope was a fun exercise where we set up a couple of tables. Y'all got to come down from the dais and collaborate amongst yourselves to kind of map out the land uses and the transportation needs and connections in Granbury. So we went back to Freese and Nichols HQ and we scanned those boards in and we started poring over those maps and went in and tweaked the future land use map to incorporate a lot of that feedback, tweak the thoroughfare map to incorporate that feedback. What you'll see tonight ties directly back to that input that you gave us back in June. It also ties back to the input that we heard a little bit earlier from the online survey, from the open house that we had in the spring, and hopefully this relates back to everything that we heard and is a good representation and a way to put that feedback into action. So I want to point out one new feature that is a little bit different compared to the current plan. So the current plan has land use categories like you'll see, and it's got a description of the land use, and it talks about what it is, what types of uses go into that land use category, where those uses are appropriate, and it has some conditions depending on the specific use. We want this plan to be very useful, both for staff and for P&Z as you're considering zoning changes, particularly difficult zoning changes that might involve a large change of use from single family to commercial, or from retail to industrial, or retail to mixed use. As you're making that decision, and as council is ultimately making that decision, we want you to have a lot of tools at your disposal so that as you're considering a zoning change and you're looking at the future land use map and thinking, how does this work together with our 20-year policy, you've got a lot of different things that you can consider and look at. So these dashboards provide a breakdown not only of what is this district, what are its characteristics, but on a use basis, how appropriate is each use within that district? So that as you're considering a zoning change and Cody or Kira is up here talking about, here are all the uses that are allowed under this zoning district that the applicant wants to change to, you'll be able to look at this dashboard and say, well, I see that this use is appropriate, but this use might not be. Similar to the tables, you've got an appropriateness scale, and each of those uses has between 1 and 4 dots, and that is on a use basis what's appropriate. That might not necessarily tell you what zoning districts is appropriate or what zoning district is compatible. So we've listed that as well underneath the description. This district is considered compatible with certain zoning district designations, so that we don't have to guess, well, I see that it says this, I see that it has these kinds of characteristics, but I can't really tell whether or not that means, this district or this district. That's listed out as having either high compatibility or limited compatibility. So we have a dashboard for each of these different zoning districts, starting with estate residential. And I'm going to go through these fairly quickly until I get to some of our new districts, because these are fairly conventional. There's not a whole lot of change with your estate residential, your low-density residential. It's still very similar to what you have today in terms of primarily a single-family residential use area. It has high compatibility with all of your R districts from R12 to R7. So that the city can be a little bit nimble in terms of you get an application that comes in for an R7, if it says low-density residential on the map, that's generally considered to have high compatibility, as long as it stays within that R7. Now, if they want to go below R7, that would mean a PED, and again, you've got a little bit of guidance to go with what is appropriate within this district. So you'll see in the tables that we've got another column that says considerations next to each of those development types and those use types. That provides an additional set of considerations for you to keep in mind as far as, okay, this use type might be appropriate in certain circumstances, but it might not be appropriate across the board in this district. So an example here would be zero lot line homes, which is a detached product that is denser than your typical detached single family. It's denser than a cottage type single family, and we'll look a little bit closer with that when we get to the housing section. But we've added in a few additional considerations with that type because it's a little bit different in nature and character than traditional single family detached. With a couple of these, you'll also notice that local commercial gets some consideration, both in your estate residential and your low-density residential, and as we go along, you'll see that start to repeat. Within each area, since we're doing what's commonly referred to as a bubble map in a lot of these areas, as we get into the central part of the city, then we start to draw it with parcel lines. But since our undeveloped areas are, for the most part, a blank slate, and we're covering wide areas with a single color, in this case yellow, we want to leave a little bit of consideration for where you have two major roads meeting and there might be some commercial land value there where two large roads intersect, that we don't necessarily completely throw out consideration of development for commercial, development for retail, provided that it's at a scale that's neighborhood serving and we're not putting a large big box development in the middle of a neighborhood. We're certainly not putting large industrial in the middle of a neighborhood, but we don't necessarily want to give up those commercial corners or say that you can only develop residential when retail commercial might not only be the highest and best use of that land, but might also be good neighborhood serving retail commercial that brings value to those neighborhoods. So you'll see that pop up throughout these. And then if you look down at the bottom where we have public and semi-public, that's going to be appropriate everywhere because that is your city facilities, your county facilities, libraries, schools, churches, those types of uses. So from low density, we move into medium density. So that's going to be your smaller lot, single-family residential, your 8.4 and your R7. That's also going to encompass your MD1, patio homes, townhomes. So you start to see that appropriateness get higher for those middle types of housing that are in between single-family detached and high-density residential. Might be some limited appropriateness with multifamily, but you see that comes with some conditions when you look at the appropriateness scale for medium density. Needs to be located at the borders of these districts in a transition zone so that it can kind of serve as a buffer between the lower density and retail commercial rather than going in the middle of low density. High-density residential, that's when you get up to density of about 10 to 18 dwelling units per acre generally. So that incorporates not only your largest apartment complexes, which we describe as 8 or more units, but also smaller apartment complexes, some townhomes and duplexes, though they're at kind of the lower end of the scale. This is really considered to be an area where we've kind of reserved it for multifamily. Of course, the idea behind the appropriateness is, these are the areas that are set aside for multifamily and the other areas are set aside for single family. But you get a little bit more of the appropriateness with the local commercial, regional commercial, mixed use, because these are generally in areas where you start to transition into those commercial uses. So the borders get a little bit blurred in terms of what what is the highest and best use of the land. Already covered public and semi-public, parks and open space. These are generally considered to be appropriate anywhere with any type of development. We do have some considerations for development that's integrated, or parks that are integrated with other types of uses. Mixed use, you have this category currently, blend of residential and non-residential uses that can be vertical mixed use with uses stacked on top of each other, or horizontal mixed use. So similar to the multifamily, we've obviously got an integration of commercial uses there, but they're both considered to kind of be on equal footing in terms of residential appropriateness versus commercial appropriateness. Local commercial was given a little bit higher sway than regional commercial, since regional commercial is kind of more of your big box developments, grocery anchored types of highway oriented development that's really geared more towards your commercial districts. So this is a new district, and that kind of ties back into some of the feedback that we heard about the lake kind of being the showpiece of Granbury, wanting to have a better access to the lake, or at least maintain access to the lake for not only individuals who are along the lake, but also the community as a whole. We also heard some feedback about wanting to keep things the scale that they are along the lake, not allow it to get taller, not allow it to get boxed in by either larger apartment buildings or hotels or other types of commercial uses. So this is an area, particularly along the central part of the lake on either side of 377, where we're considering a lot of different housing types, but you can see that the appropriateness scale kind of stops at those smaller apartment complexes, your two-story complexes, and then if you get higher than that, then we still want to maintain the same scale that we have there currently. Local commercial is given higher appropriateness to serve that residential use along the lake, to not completely say no to commercial along the lakefront, but to keep it at a smaller scale that is not kind of drawing its own traffic. It's kind of serving the folks who are drawn to the lake itself. Lake Core, this is adjacent to the lakefront district. It's really centered around the area of 377 as you go on either side of where the lake crosses 377. Currently today, it's large-scale commercial development. Obviously, we don't want that to go away. I mean, it serves the community, provides a great function not only for Granbury, but also for the county. It's a good tax generator. We want to keep this area being a big tax generator and a big draw so that it can kind of continue to be the center of activity along 377 and along the lake. So it stays with a largely commercial flavor. Restaurants, some hotel, but fairly limited in terms of it being just kind of a hotel destination. We want this to be a full community serving area that everyone in Granbury can enjoy, and not just cater to tourists or folks who are staying overnight. Some limited consideration for multifamily, but if you consider 377 as kind of being the first tier of development and the frontage along 377, any multifamily, we would want that on that second tier and not facing right on 377. So we'll pull up the map in just a second so you can kind of see how these all lay out. But do want to point out three overlays that we're considering. The first is downtown, which on our current map is kind of given a bunch of different types of uses, public, semi-public, commercial uses, but you really have to look at the zoning map and go to the downtown chapter to see kind of a delineation of where downtown is. So this really differentiates downtown from the rest of those individual districts. The individual districts are still there, but downtown itself is given a geographic footprint that for the most part lines up with the CBD zoning district and promotes the goals of that district for kind of mixed-use developments, destination-driven developments, and a mixture of housing. We have two 377 corridor overlays, and we did two because 377 kind of has a different character depending on whether you're coming from the east, from Fort Worth, or you're coming from the west, from Stephenville. Coming from the east, it's largely retail-driven, lots of grocery stores, lots of retail destinations along 377 East. There are also a lot of car lots that are their own economic generators, but also may potentially represent a redevelopment opportunity. So as we move forward, the East 377 corridor, basically from the city limits to about James Road, is considered to be more of a retail atmosphere to maintain that retail attraction. And some of the improvements that we're hoping to make to the thoroughfare plan will hopefully provide some additional connections to support that retail traffic so that it's not all dumping onto 377. Contrast with West 377, where you have areas like the hospital, and the airport, and the industrial park, really more of an employment generator, has the potential to be a large employment center for the city and for the county. It really already is with the hospital and some of the other businesses that are there, but has the potential to grow into more of that. Not that retail wouldn't necessarily be allowed in those areas, and not that office or employment wouldn't be allowed on East 377, but the attempt here is to try to play up to the strengths of both areas and preserve what provides the character or builds the character for both areas and play on those strengths. So as we look at our map, you can kind of see that geography in action on the east side and the west side. And again, you can refer to your handouts if the map is a little bit hard to see on the screen. But the West 377 corridor would essentially run from the city limits on the west to right about where 377 crosses the lake, with the hospital there on the right side of that image. And then the airport and the industrial park in the center of that image. So depending on which side of 377 you're on, we've oriented it a little bit more towards commercial or industrial to take advantage of the presence of the airport, to take advantage of the presence of the loop and the connectivity that ultimately would provide up to Interstate 20. The envisioned atmosphere of the area around the hospital would be to further build on the medical office uses that are already there, and to make that kind of a medical hub, and thus a hub for employment, a hub for office uses, that make that kind of a professional center and grow the job space of the city, which was another aspect of the public input that we got, that there could be more jobs here in town. Folks that have to go to work generally tend to commute a long distance. They're commuting to Fort Worth, or maybe to Weatherford, or maybe to Cleburne, that we need more jobs here in the city for folks to drive to. That also helps stabilize the housing in the area, to provide more homes for primary residents and folks who work here, and bolster the incomes to be able to acquire that housing. So this is downtown lakefront and then the lake core. So you can see downtown is delineated there in the upper left. And again, those boundaries don't follow exactly the CBD, but they come very close, extending along Pearl Street, and then north and south up to the railroad tracks. And then in the pink, you have the lakefront district, which hugs the lake, and then extends a little bit north of Bridge Street. And then the lake core is in the teal, that generally covers the retail and commercial areas along 377 west of Pearl Street. And then the East 377 corridor, as I mentioned, runs from about James Road to the city limits, and along both sides of 377. So again, this is essentially your primary retail areas along 377. One of the key drivers with this, I mentioned preserving the retail uses, but the commercial frontage and commercial corridor also Of course, attracts a lot of automobile-oriented uses. It also has a tendency to attract a lot of implement-based uses, which means a lot of outdoor storage, a lot of outdoor display of machinery. That's appropriate in the community as a whole because of your location relative to the Metroplex, relative to a lot of agricultural areas. You're a regional hub for Hood County, for Somervell County, so naturally a lot of large dealerships, either of equipment or of car dealers, would want to locate here, especially along a major corridor. But with this stretch of 377, we wanted to make an attempt at limiting some of that outdoor display, some of that outdoor storage, and really provide a good front for 377 as TxDOT rebuilds it, as they add landscaping and shared use paths, and provide that image as folks are coming into the community from Fort Worth, that you kind of have your primary retail there front and center. Outside of the overlay, the idea is that that's where your kind of outdoor display-oriented uses, your implement sales would be a little bit more appropriate, and also in other commercial areas of the city. But this area of 377 would really be highlighted as kind of Granbury's front door as you're coming in from the east. So this is the future land use map as a whole. You again have a copy of this in your handouts if you wanted to take a closer look at that. One thing also to point out that kind of drove the conversation of differentiating 377 from the rest of the commercial areas is that we've combined the commercial areas into one commercial and then one industrial district, rather than having a light commercial and a heavy commercial district. We wanted to cast as broad a net as possible with commercial to provide some flexibility for the city, again, when making zoning decisions, and property owners when they're looking to invest in their property or to purchase new property. So rather than dividing that commercial district up into office or into heavy commercial, the one commercial district as differentiated from industrial, that's been combined on this map. So that gave rise to the need, which we were looking at doing anyway, to look at an overlay for 377. It also kind of draws a starker contrast between the commercial and the industrial side of the equation. So industrial would not only be appropriate for kind of your large manufacturing types of uses or logistics types of uses that need that rail connectivity or need that highway connectivity. It would also have be able to absorb some of that smaller scale kind of flex space that we see popping up all over the place, particularly in the county, but it's very popular because they're able to sign smaller leases in a way that the larger warehouses are not. So you see a lot of contracting businesses go into those, a lot of auto repair type uses go into kind of these smaller industrial buildings where you have kind of one roll-up door per tenant space and a little office, and it's usually inline. So we broadened the industrial, and you can see there's quite a bit of purple on the west side that would incorporate a lot of those types of uses. So one thing that we want to get your feedback on, that we hope to get public feedback on in October, is the appropriateness of the districts and kind of the allocation of the land uses. The overlays themselves, it can be a pretty broad topic of discussion as to whether we should treat this area, inherently differently than this area, or if it has a color, should the color be the same for everybody throughout the city. So again, kind of going back to our questions that we started out with, do we believe that this land use map represents, a good future for Granbury? Do we think it allocates land uses in a equitable way, but also a way that represents the city's values? So I'm going to pause there, but before we get into housing, not to necessarily stop the pace that we're on, but I do want to pause in case anybody has any questions or anything that they want to discuss, or if you want to keep absorbing, we can come back to this at the end of the presentation. So I'll pause here if anybody has any questions or comments they want to make. Or I can keep going. Keep going. Okay, we'll keep going. So that dovetails nicely with the topic of housing in the plan. This is a separate chapter, and we intend to kind of keep this a separate chapter from the land use discussion. But of course, housing drives a lot of different things, both economically and also in terms of the city's character and its values. But do want to touch on a couple of things that we presented back during the community input and visioning phase when we looked at Granbury's demographics. So between summer 2019 and summer 2023, Granbury issued about 45 residential permits per month. And based on the conversations we've had and the data we've been able to look at since then, that's only going to keep going. Both in terms of your permitting volume and also in terms of the number of lots that you're platting. That's not going to slow down. On the one hand, the home values that we've been seeing and the price escalation in the housing market is driven by a lack of supply. But not all supply is created equal. So we want to have enough housing so that everybody has a place to live and so that people's property values aren't going like this and keeping people out of the market, but that doesn't mean we want to give up high quality housing, or that doesn't mean that we want to settle for housing that we're going to have to deal with, or we're going to have to abate, or look at posting in 20 or 30 years. So a couple other things to note kind of before we get into those strategies is the increase in home values is outpacing the increase in local income levels. Incomes have been generally going up across the state over the past few years, but home values have gone up considerably more. And in Granbury, the average income is a little bit lower than in the county, but the home prices are comparable between Granbury and the county. So a 68% increase was seen in the 10 years between 2012 and 2022. And that has a couple of different effects. It keeps people out of the market, who otherwise might be in the market for a home. And it also stretches the budgets of folks who are able to acquire a home, but either their taxes or expenses are going up, or they have to get out of their home entirely, and that turnover isn't good for housing, and the conditions that it creates aren't good for housing. So what we heard in terms of our open house feedback and our online survey feedback, these questions essentially revolved around what different types of housing does Granbury need to focus on? What do we need more of? And it's interesting how this broke down. First of all, the answers are slightly different with the open house feedback compared to the online survey feedback. One of the ones that kind of jumps out right away is that the online survey feedback skewed a little bit more towards the smaller lot single-family residential compared to the large lot single-family residential. The patio homes stayed about the same. Townhomes was considerably more with the online survey versus the open house feedback. And it's important to keep in mind that the responses, some of them came from outside the city limits. Some of them came from outside the ETJ. The majority of the responses where we asked folks to self-identify where they were coming from, the majority did come from the city limits, but some of this feedback represents the opinions of folks who aren't currently living in Granbury. They might want to be living in Granbury, we're not exactly sure, but what this breaks down to is essentially pretty close to the housing profile that y'all have now. Unlike most cities that are positioned like Granbury relative to the Metroplex, where y'all are a little bit further out, you've got a pretty even mixture of single family and multifamily. it's about 58% single-family. So that's essentially reflected in these numbers. Now, we could get into, what are townhomes considered, what are patio homes considered. Those are kind of a gray area between single-family and multifamily. So that kind of factors into it, but essentially 50 to 60% of respondents said that Granbury, needs more single-family residential. A much smaller percentage by comparison said we think we should have more multifamily residential. And then in the middle was what we'll call middle housing between those two ends of the spectrum. So boiling it down to some of the feedback that we received both through the survey and in person, some of Granbury's greatest issues when it comes to housing is the rise of housing costs. The housing growth is too rapid relative to what it's been in the past. Granbury's growth has been pretty steady over the years, what we found looking back historically at population growth, but of course, when you live in an established neighborhood and then you drive out towards the edge of town and you start seeing all these rooftops popping up, then that does start to feel like, hey, there's a lot of people moving in very quickly. There's a lot of new houses on small lots that are happening all at once. They look a little bit different than the houses that we're accustomed to and used to seeing in certain areas of the city. And building all of the single-family residential combined with all the multifamily residential that we've seen feels like a lack of housing choice. I have to either live in this single-family home and take on a lot of maintenance and take on a lot of property taxes, or I have to live in multifamily and pay really high rent and kind of live in one of these buildings surrounded by a lot of other people. That's good for some people. It's not good for everybody. So that represents, in the minds of a lot of folks, a lack of choice. They'd like more choices. What types of housing does Granbury need more of? This kind of runs the spectrum. Essentially everything except multifamily kind of showed up on this list. Small lot, large lot. Patio homes, I've got an asterisk there because I'm going to show on the next slide what we mean by patio homes. Townhomes, accessory dwelling units in the backyard or attached to single-family residential. So the takeaway from that is we need a lot of different types of housing because we've got a lot of different types of housing needs. If you change one thing about Granbury, what would it be? Elderly and disabled might be underserved. Traffic and housing prices, again, same with the greatest issues. And then not enough affordable housing to draw in younger people so that they can afford to live and work here. So if you'll recall when we were presenting the community snapshot, there's a large amount of younger people who are family aged, not like early 20s, but kind of late 20s, early 30s, and then there's a larger amount of more retirement age folks, and not as much in between. So this comment, when you compare it to the data that we saw on the community snapshot, indicates that for that early 20s crowd, maybe getting into late 20s, there's not as much housing that can serve their needs, especially if they're not looking to rent an apartment. Need affordable housing for families, so again, that goes back to the housing affordability question. So when it comes to patio homes, that's a term that can be loaded for some folks. It's a little confusing because there's a lot of different housing types that might fall under the patio home umbrella. That was one of the choices on the survey that we asked folks to select. But other terms for patio home might be a cottage home, it might be a zero lot line home, might be a garden home. But what it essentially means is housing that's detached but has either very small setbacks, kind of the narrowest you can have and still meet fire code, or in the case of the housing on the slide, it's housing that's built right up to the property line and it has a firewall on one side. So that's generally 30 to 40 foot lot widths. Once you get above 40, then you generally have a setback on either side, and we consider that more of a small lot detached housing. This could also be known as cottage housing. So again, about 57% of the total housing stock consists of detached single family. That's not all small lot detached housing. Some of it is larger lot. When we get into the 60, 70 foot range and up, the types of housing that is more and more rarely being built new. We're mostly in the 40 to 50 foot range. We'd consider that small lots detached housing. So again, going back to Granbury's zoning typology, you've got your R7s, that kind of gets into the border between large lot and small lot. And then you've got a lot of zoning districts that go higher than that with larger lot sizes. So as with many communities, that's kind of where the rub is coming in, is that builders are wanting to go smaller and smaller, and the zoning ordinance kind of envisions something that's, this is the small end of the spectrum, what you guys are considering a little bit smaller, or a little bit too big rather, and you want to go a little bit smaller. So how do we bridge that gap then between kind of the large lot, single family developments that a lot of folks are accustomed to, let's call it 70, 80 foot wide lots, not big estate lots, but a little bit bigger, closer to the 8,000 to 10,000 square foot range. Because those homes, while they're still in demand, there's not a lot of folks who are in their mid to early 20s who can, A, afford a home on a lot that large, and B, they might not want to maintain a lot that large, because a lot goes into maintaining a large house and a large yard. And the more stuff we kind of give people to maintain, the more of a bite that takes on out of their budget. So again, not saying that one is right and one is wrong, but what the feedback that we got tends to indicate that there might be some opportunity, some desire within that middle range between the larger lots and multifamily. Again, there's a lot of terms for that as well. That tends to be housing that's kind of in the middle. Could be like what you see on your screen, which if you squint at it, it could either be townhomes or what we'd call row homes or small apartments, but generally fits into that range, generally about 9 units or less, maybe on a single lot, or they may be fee simple, but they, again, fit into that middle range, incorporate townhouses, they might incorporate duplexes, maybe getting to the zero lot line, anything kind of 8 dwelling units per acre, 10 dwelling units per acre, or over, is kind of what we're referring to as middle housing. So we touched on kind of condition of housing, but want to go into that here before we kind of get into our housing strategies and some of the programs we might want to talk about. Generally speaking, Granbury's housing is fairly new. It's less than 50 years old, but approximately 21% of housing stock was built in 1979 or earlier. So why is that important? Well, earlier than that, you're getting into pre-ban on lead-based paint, pre-ban on asbestos. While a lot of that has been addressed, a lot of those homes out there probably still have those conditions. And of course, there's no way to know for sure exactly how many of them have those conditions, but someone who's buying a house that was built before 1979, there's a good chance they're walking into some of those conditions. That might harm their ability to obtain financing. That might harm their ability to be able to afford not only to buy one of those houses, but also to live in one of those houses, because of the amount of work that might have to go into that. Does that make them bad houses? No, it doesn't. In many cases, they might be better built than housing that's being put up today. But what it does mean is that there's kind of a different set of considerations that need to go into older housing and kind of the effect that has on neighborhoods and on the amount of upkeep that folks are able to handle. So when we look at housing, we want to keep some categories in mind, and the current comp plan does have this kind of categorization. We went a little bit further with it. The current plan has 3 categories. We went with 5. The first is your new housing, what you're seeing more and more of. Being new housing, we're not too worried about it yet, but we definitely want to monitor and make sure that those neighborhoods are stable, that they aren't seeing disinvestment, that they are well set up for the future to the extent that the city is able to do that. Keep in touch with HOAs with those neighborhoods. For housing that's a little bit newer, it's newer than 50 years old, and I'm going to refer to my sheet because I can't see that on the screen. It's less than 50 years old, but they're in, the neighborhoods are in good condition. We want to perpetuate those conditions. We don't, necessarily want to get too involved because they're doing pretty well on their own, but perpetuate that condition. But some neighborhoods are starting to show signs of decline. We can probably remember when a lot of these neighborhoods were new 20, 30 years ago, but since then they've started to show a little bit of decline. We're seeing more unkept lawns, we're seeing more driveways that have failed, we're seeing more obvious signs of not maintaining those homes, even though they're not that old. They might need a roof replacement. A lot of those conditions, they're not only a burden on the property owner, they're a burden on the neighborhood as well. So we want to kind of have a different set of strategies for those than we do for the first two categories. Homes that are older than 50 years, those might be showing signs of significant decline. They might not. In some cases, we can't always see it, but there's kind of a cascading effect of maintenance problems, as foundations fail, as roofs fail, as you get into situations where, if I'm going to touch this room, if I want to invest in my home, then I've got to bring it up to, a certain code standard, and that's just kind of cost prohibitive. The same is true of commercial buildings too, even though we're talking about housing. And then, of course, Granbury also has a separate category of historic homes, homes that are protected by a different set of codes and standards. Obviously, these have been identified as being highly significant, contributing to Granbury's housing fabric, so we want to continue to conserve and preserve those homes. And by default, this category includes homes that are on the historic register. So what does that look like kind of mapped out? We didn't go through and do a housing assessment of the entire city. It's not too difficult to do kind of a neighborhood level assessment, but to really get down to the nitty gritty and kind of look at things on a parcel basis. This is essentially a windshield survey. Again, we didn't go into each of these houses or knock on the door and kind of ask what the condition of the home is in. But based on a windshield survey, we think that the homes in the center part of the city, or this is essentially the downtown overlay that we showed you earlier, kind of break down in terms of conditions like you see on the map. So green would be conserve, preserve. So those would be homes on the national or the historic register. Perpetuate is the homes in the blue that appear to be in excellent shape. Rehabilitate, again, that falls somewhere on the spectrum of, might need significant repair, might be okay, but, again, that cost of maintaining a home is high, and it's even higher when a home is a little bit older. So what this tells us is, there's a lot of homes out there that, they're not only good shelter, but they're contributing to the fabric of the neighborhood. But we want to keep in mind kind of the needs of those homeowners and kind of have some strategies in mind for preserving those neighborhoods so that they continue to contribute to the fabric of Granbury, that they continue to provide housing that's good, that's quality, that's affordable, and that residents have a chance to live here, and that quality housing means housing for residents and not just Airbnb and not just institutional investor-owned types of housing, but that we are preserving kind of our owner-occupied profile, that the folks who are living there are using it as housing, and that it's not just used for commercial purposes. So the next couple of slides has some goals and strategies that relate to these different categories. So I'm not going to go through all of these in great detail. You do have those in your larger handout. And the handout, please take that home. Please kind of look through it. If there's something that we didn't cover tonight and you have a question, again, our goal is to come back and have public input next month. We'll also be coming back to you with a workshop in November. But as we go through each of these goals, we want to assign some relevance to each of those housing conditions so that each housing condition has multiple strategies that we can take to maintain good conditions, to perpetuate where things are in good condition, and to add value and to address the needs of homeowners as housing starts to decline or faces decline. So that comes down to a lot of different strategies, homeowner education, outreach to first-time homeowners, communication between HOAs and the city, adding public value where we can in terms of streetscape enhancements, sidewalks, connectivity to parks, or building parks in areas where we need more park space, connecting amenities to housing, and we'll show that on a slide in just a second. Working with the school district to identify what their forecasts are seeing in terms of their student enrollment. Obviously, we know generation to generation that some generations are larger than others, and school districts do a lot of forecasting in terms of how many students are we going to have on a yearly basis, on a decade by decade basis, and that's going to have a direct impact on housing. So coordinating with the school district to kind of see what those trends are. And then some tools that we will go into on kind of these next slides. And we're close to the end, I promise. But just a couple of ways that we can align historic preservation with our housing needs through the zoning code, using that to expand housing options in existing neighborhoods, appropriate densities. So, if we've got lots that will support things like ADUs, or they might support things like duplexes, and we've got a house that's kind of in disrepair, and the cost to refurbish that house is too great, but the land value is such that, hey, I really need to build a couple of units on this lot, that we've got some flexibility to do that in an appropriate way. This next one is what I'd kind of call the good cop, bad cop approach to a building code. That a lot of building codes out there are kind of, you must bring everything up to this standard, or we want you to build to this standard. And there's a lot of good things about that. But when you're starting from, a 70-year-old home, when you're trying to meet a 2024 standard, that can be very difficult and cost prohibitive. So making sure our building codes are aligned to those needs. Community land trusts. This is typically a strategy that you see in bigger cities, but it's a model where a nonprofit will purchase housing, and it will essentially preserve the affordability of that housing by selling it to qualified folks, and you'll own the home, the land trust will own the land, and there's a certain appreciation curve that is associated with that house, so that when it's sold, it doesn't go through the flipper phenomenon, where I bought it for $100,000, I flipped it for $400,000, or I bought it to use as an Airbnb. It's actually used for housing, and can help to maintain the housing values in sensitive neighborhoods. Encouraging adaptive reuse of properties in downtown, as appropriate, adjacent to existing commercial areas to unlock value in those homes and on those properties. Connectivity to community amenities, and again, this kind of goes back to how we implement the future land use map. When we look at where housing is proposed, that it's well located to schools, to parks and open space, to city facilities, libraries, senior centers. This map is also on your handout, since I know those icons are small, but the key takeaway here is that where we've got existing public investments in facilities, that we want to locate housing close to those investments. So I touched on a few of these already, but making sure that small-scale developers kind of have a seat at the table, that you're not only seeing housing from kind of the D.R. Hortons of the world, but that there's not any kind of barriers that I'm facing if I want to come in and kind of build one or two houses as infill developments, that there may even be incentives. The city has a neighborhood empowerment zone, kind of leveraging that to provide some incentives for small-scale builders. faith-based partnerships are in use in a lot of surrounding communities, including in Johnson County, where we've got Christmas in Action that is a way that the city can leverage a partnership to help folks with deferred maintenance on houses, to upgrade their houses in situations where they might not be able to afford to. Housing tax credit program, tax abatements and buying down the cost of a home. Community Land Trust and Housing Tax Credit both kind of do that in different ways. Tax Increment Reinvestment Zone in a similar way leverages tax revenue to put it back into the area and bring up the value of homes. So again, this is something we want to tie back to these guiding principles and to the feedback that we heard. Keep Granbury attractive to residents and to diversify demographically and economically by removing barriers to housing, by making it so that folks of all income levels are able to find housing and enjoy the benefits of living in Granbury. So we do have this table of housing goals and strategies, as mentioned, that tie back into those guiding principles. So a lot of those are just kind of building off of the strategies that we've presented this evening. So I'm not going to go into great detail with these. You do have them provided in your handouts. They also build on the strategies and recommendations of the current comprehensive plan. So I'd definitely ask for feedback on these, and again, if we don't cover something this evening, that we can cover it at our next P&Z workshop. The last one that I want to touch on real quickly is transportation. We again, like with housing, we kind of heard from across the spectrum. Obviously, we want a well-connected vehicular street network and sidewalks and bike and pedestrian trail networks and complete streets. So we got kind of across the board in terms of, hey, here's what we want to look at in terms of transportation. So with our current thoroughfare map, this was built in kind of a world that doesn't exist anymore, where the city could involuntarily annex, and we could look at that map and assume that Granbury is going to grow to the extent of that ETJ. So those street alignments, those are roads that the city is eventually going to take over and maintain and build. We live in a little bit different world now, so in terms of our map in 2024, we still have a lot of the same needs. We still need to provide connectivity, we still need to provide relief for drivers on 377, but there's a lot more coordination that needs to happen now outside of the city limits. So some of these connections have shifted a little bit in terms of what we think we can feasibly build, particularly that southern loop that runs parallel to 377 is shifted to the south. Again, conversations are ongoing with the county in terms of how to align this with the county's thoroughfare map. And providing connectivity and kind of secondary networks to 377. There's a couple of additions on the east side of the city, number 6. So you've got this list in your packet of key opportunities. So number 6 is making an additional connection to serve as a parallel route to 377. Also a northern loop, which is number 3, that would connect 377 with Weatherford Highway and provide a secondary way to get east and west on the north side of the city. So a lot of these are not necessarily saying, hey, we can go out and fix 377. We're hoping that the improvements that TxDOT is making will provide some relief there, but providing secondary roadways. Backage roads is an improvement that we're thinking could have some value and some impact parallel to both to the loop and to 377. So number 2 would provide some secondary connectivity around Loop 567. And we want to carry that concept through in as many different places as we can, so that if you're going from one business to another, you're not having to get on the 377 and then back to the business. So number 8, as well as an example of that on the west side of the city. So I'm going to stop there. I know that's a lot of information, and that's why we gave you some stuff that you can take home and kind of look at and ruminate on. But we wanted to provide that update in terms of some of the concepts that we've been looking at, some of the things that we would like to present in some form at our open house next month in early October. So I appreciate you sitting through that long presentation patiently, and definitely would like to open it up for any questions that you have or anything that we want to go back through and look over.
On your thoroughfare plan, I thought we talked about a missing connection of Crawford Drive to Old Cleveland Road, which is Water's Edge Drive. I don't see that on here. I'm trying. Well, it's a way to leave something on that side. You have Crawford for a while, and then it just ends. So we had it where, no, it's just I'm not sure why I know that got.
Across private property to make that happen.
So,
It would extend behind Dairy Queen and tie into Old Cleveland Road, which is actually just the north end of Water's Edge Drive.
on the south end?
On the west end. Well, what do you consider south, going towards Stephenville? I consider that west.
It's west.
I consider it west.
Going west.
Anyway, we talked about that at the workshop, but I don't see it on there. Has a better chance of this huge crossing here.
That's not good. We can draw lines on paper.
So we've got a connection that runs north of 377 along Water's Edge, but which one are we missing?
Crawford, that runs on, from east to west, behind 37, I don't know where to tell you. Basically, it runs from Business 377, and it goes all the way down to,
I think that's, little green line is it. It doesn't have a number. Yeah.
oh, I see it, yeah, I'm sorry. Okay.
That's actually one of the more doable things.
But I couldn't see it on my little map, you're right, thank you. It
The
is-
southern loop is really nice,
That's like,
but I don't think we'll see it in any of our lifetimes, having been to the county meetings as well. But the little green line just north of 377, but at the right of Water's Edge is what we're talking about. That may actually be doable in the next 5 years.
Should that not be dashed as a proposed then? I mean, because that's a solid line.
You're right, Tim, you're right. Because that road doesn't exist.
That road does not exist.
Okay, we can add that in there. So connecting to Harbor Lakes. And sorry, you were saying Old Cleveland Road, that wasn't
no.
jogging anything in my
Edge.
mind.
No, to Water's Edge Drive. Oh, but they call the part that's north of 377, it's actually called address Old Cleveland Road.
Okay.
Yeah, not
Cleveland.
Cleveland.
It
Cleveland,
changes
yeah.
names at 377,
Yeah.
Okay,
but I see it there now. It just allows you to offload on the business and come down Crawford, and you can, if there's a big wreck in there, you can at least get to that point. Get to the fence.
so is the thought there to take that all the way over to Harbor Lakes?
What already exists between Harbor Lakes and, would it be easier if one of us went over there and showed you what we're talking
Why
about?
don't I come to you?
I think you already have it on there.
It's
on there, I
It's
just
not-
didn't see it.
It needs to be dashed. It's this.
Yeah, we're talking about
No, the dash stuff means it's out of the
this line
ETJ.
right here. This road exists. Right. This road doesn't.
Dashed,
nice.
Okay,
So
that needs to
be
That needs to be dashed.
Okay.
And that's why I actually put a number on, so I think that might actually be doable.
I don't know.
As opposed to, say, the south loop.
How you work Lakestone Terrace and the gas station and all that in there, I don't know.
I know.
You gotta go across Lakestone Terrace's entrance to the road does, so,
Yeah, I know.
with a stop sign or something.
On the community amenities chart, do we use the same icon for fresh produce and convenience stores? I don't see a difference in those shopping baskets. I'm on this one.
Which one?
Oh, are they different colors?
Yeah. But, yeah, you're right, they look pretty similar.
My old eyes don't discern a difference.
So we can definitely change that color, make it contrast a little bit more.
I think that's important. Convenience stores and where you get fresh produce are significantly different.
Yeah, fresh produce could be a fruit stand, or it can be a grocery store.
I don't mean to demean the convenience stores that has a bowl of 3 bananas in it for sale, but it's not exactly a produce stand.
Right. So I'll just flash forward, but if any questions come to you, then we can definitely go back, but.
I had a question. Is there anything addressing like future expansion of public parks? I see where the existing parks are marked. Because I remember making a comment during one of the public hearings that there were no public parks south of 377. All your parks are north of 377.
We've started to look at, it's not going to be updates to the parks plan from 2020, but since it's gotten to about 5 years, then it's kind of due for a little bit of a refresh. So we've started looking at goals and future expansions that are outlined in that plan. Some of those things have already been accomplished or put in motion. So that will be incorporated in the kind of the next round of information that we bring to y'all in November. We're still kind of in the process of looking at that, and we're not going to redo it completely since it was just done in 2020. But that kind of list of here's where you need parks, here's what you need to do to upgrade your current parks, that'll be incorporated within the new plan.
All right. Yeah, I just think it's an area that needs to be addressed because you have a large tax-paying population south of 377 that literally have to drive miles to a city park, so.
So on the screen, we've got kind of our upcoming schedule. So our next step would be to take this information to the public, probably have a somewhat condensed version of the presentation that you saw tonight with the transportation strategies. Hopefully we can refine those a little bit more with the county. Kind of to the point that a couple of folks made, that southern loop, while it does show connectivity, it's going to be a big lift to do anything approximating that in the ETJ or outside the ETJ, so we're going to need, obviously, county to step up in a big way to accomplish that. So that line is kind of to simulate conversation with them, and hopefully by the time Certainly, we come back to y'all in November, we will have had some of those conversations and have gotten some of their input. So that mine may change. In fact, it very well may change, but we want to put it on there to kind of show, here's what Granbury's priorities are in terms of we need some secondary connectivity and mobility so that not everybody has to get on 377. So hopefully those conversations can continue to move forward with the county, and we can refine that a little bit more. So kind of our next scheduled appearance with y'all is going to be in November, before Thanksgiving. I think we have a tentative date for the open house in October. It'd be October 3rd, but I believe, Cody, the plan is to post that so that council can be in attendance, and y'all are certainly invited to attend that as well, and provide any feedback. And contact Kira if you have any more feedback or questions, and we can get in touch with her. But definitely please take your handouts home and your copy of the presentation so that we can continue the dialogue. So with that, I appreciate your attention tonight and all the feedback.
Thank you very much. There are no further business. Please let me know if you're interested in the January workshops, January 6th and 7th, I think it was. And then if no further business, the meeting's adjourned. Thank you all for coming.